The air in the Charleston estate of widow Beatrice Wren was thick with the scent of magnolia and decay. Her husband, Thomas Wren, had been a man of influence and iron will, but he had left her barren and embittered when death claimed him in the summer of 1842. Though she had inherited his fortune and sprawling property, the absence of an heir gnawed at her, leaving an emptiness she sought to fill by other means. Beatrice was not a woman content to wait for fate. She had seen the town's whispers, the polite judgments behind fans and lace collars mocking her childlessness. And so, she devised a plan no soul in Charleston could fathom. She would use her inherited slaves to manufacture the progeny her late husband never provided. Her first target was a young field slave named Eliza. She had the grace of youth, though worn by toil, and Beatrice considered her ideal. Summoned to the drawing room, Eliza's heart pounded, sensing both the cold authority in the widow's gaze and the dread of the impossible tasks she was about to be asked to endure. "Tomorrow," Beatrice said, her voice clipped and precise, "you will prepare yourself. Each night, one of you will sleep in the chambers of the house. You understand?" Eliza swallowed hard, the words taking root in her chest like a stone. She understood all too well. There was no room for refusal. The Wren estate thrived on obedience, and its mistress ruled with the precision of a monarch and the cruelty of a judge. By the next evening, the first assignment began. Eliza was led to the master bedroom, where the widow's late husband had once slept. Beatrice remained behind a partitioned screen, watching with a calculating eye, ensuring that her plan was executed precisely. Each move was deliberate, every sigh and tear catalogued, yet the slaves were powerless, bound by chains invisible but as strong as iron. Meanwhile, rumors of the widow's intentions whispered through the servant quarters. The older slaves, some of whom had seen the lengths to which masters and mistresses would go to preserve their lineage, murmured warnings to the younger ones. Eliza, caught between fear and the urge to survive, listened silently, wondering how many nights she would endure and what might become of her sisters in chains. As the nights passed, one after another, Beatrice's twisted ambition manifested in the shadows of her estate. The house's grand chambers, filled with portraits of ancestors and relics of wealth, became arenas for the widow's obsession. Each slave brought to a room bore the invisible weight of inheritance she had imagined, the burden of producing heirs she would claim as her own. Yet within the silent despair, small acts of defiance began to grow. The older slaves taught the younger ones patience, subtlety, and the quiet endurance necessary to survive such horrors. They whispered in corners, exchanged knowing glances, and passed warnings in coded language. The estate itself became a labyrinth of observation, where survival depended on silence and cunning. By the month's end, Beatrice remained vigilant, obsessively tracking which rooms had been used, noting every detail of compliance and resistance. She believed herself in control, unchallenged, her desire for legacy overriding morality. Yet beneath the opulent exterior of the house, a storm of fear, sorrow, and suppressed fury quietly gathered, one that no amount of wealth or authority could fully contain. Eliza, once naive and obedient, began to feel a spark of resolve. Though her body was captive, her mind remained hers. And in the depth of the night, when the widow's gaze did not reach, she whispered promises to herself and the other girls, soft as the wind through the magnolias, that one day this tyranny would be undone. Beatrice, for all her precision, did not yet know that in the silent quarters, alliances were forming, and the seeds of resistance were taking root. The estate might seem orderly, its corridors filled with wealth and power, but behind the velvet drapes and polished floors, the strength of those enslaved was growing a quiet, patient power that waited for the right moment to strike. The widow believed she had orchestrated destiny itself, but in reality, she had only begun a tale that would be remembered, whispered among generations, of cruelty, cunning, and the unbreakable will of those who refused to be owned, even in the heart of Charleston's grandest house. The next morning dawned grey, heavy with mist rolling in from the marshlands, as if the world itself mourned what was happening inside the Wren estate. Widow Beatrice sat at the long mahogany table in her study. A ledger opened before her. Ink pooled at the nib of her quill as she carefully recorded Eliza's name under a column labeled Prospects. She wrote the word with pride, Prospects, as though they were cattle, as though they had chosen any of this. Her mouth thinned with satisfaction. Order must guide creation, she murmured to herself. Outside her study, the household moved with unusual quiet. No one wanted their footsteps heard, no voice raised loud enough to draw the widow's attention. Even the overseer, Mr. Calder, stoic, brutal, and loyal only to coin, paced with unease. He had endured the widow's eccentricities since Thomas Wren's death. But this was madness wrapped in lace. By midday, the next girl was summoned. Her name was Ruth, barely 17, small-framed and soft-voiced. Her hands trembled as she stood before Beatrice, who observed her with the cold appraisal of a merchant evaluating grain. "You will go to the East Chamber tonight," Beatrice said. "Do not faint. It is unbecoming." "Yes, ma'am," Ruth whispered, though her eyelids fluttered with terror. Beatrice waved her away like smoke. But as Ruth turned, her eyes met Eliza's standing near the hallway, carrying a basket of linens. Eliza did not speak. She didn't need to. A soft shake of the head, the faintest lift of her chin stay steady passed between them. The small gesture steadied Ruth's legs enough for her to walk. That night, the East Chamber was lit by only one oil lamp. Beatrice didn't watch this time from behind a partition. Instead, she waited in the adjoining parlor, pretending to read, though her eyes were fixed on the door. Ruth emerged an hour later like she had aged a decade. Her breath hitched, her shoulders shook, but she kept her head bowed and silent. The widow smiled with chilling approval. 2 nights later came Mary, then Fanny, then Lydia. Each girl assigned a different room, a different ritual of Beatrice's making. Every night the estate grew heavier with unspoken fear. But alongside that fear, something else was growing, something Beatrice could not measure in her ledger. Solidarity. In the slave quarters, women gathered after sunset, whispering beneath the creaking beams. Eliza sat in the center, her eyes fierce despite her exhaustion. "We must endure," she said quietly. "But endurance is not submission." A few murmured agreement. Others shook their heads, afraid. "What choice do we have?" Lydia whispered. "She owns us. She watches us like a hawk." "She watches what she expects," Eliza said, "not what she fears." Ruth leaned forward, her hands clasped. "What does she fear?" Eliza's voice dropped to a whisper. "Losing control. Losing what she thinks she owns. If we move quietly, if we stand as one, she won't see the storm coming." The older women nodded knowingly. They had seen storms topple mansions before, just not this kind. Meanwhile, Beatrice continued expanding her plans. She sent Calder into town with instructions to acquire tonics, strengthening herbs, and even a midwife to be kept on standby. "Too early for that," Calder muttered under his breath as he rode. "But the mistress has lost the last of her reason." The town whispered, as towns do. They didn't know the details, but they felt the strangeness. The widow buying certain herbs, the tense faces of the Wren slaves when they came to market, the way Calder avoided questions. Charleston's gossip wheel spun without slowing. Back at the estate, Beatrice added more columns to her ledger. Cycle, chamber, compliance. Like she could track life with ink, like she could own creation itself. But the slaves, now communicating through glances, coded humming, small hidden notes twisted into broom handles, had begun to prepare for resistance, not loud, not violent, but a slow, growing refusal in spirit. It started with Mary pretending to faint sooner than expected, forcing the widow to bring smelling salts and abandon her vigil. Fanny kept her breathing shallow and silent, making it impossible for Beatrice to determine if she was awake or asleep. Eliza mastered the art of looking compliant, while her mind was miles away, memorizing every corridor, every locked drawer, every vulnerability in the routine. Beatrice sensed something just a flicker that the results were not aligning with her expectations. The ledger's tidy boxes remained unnervingly empty of the progress she demanded. "It must work," she hissed one evening, pacing before the parlor window. "It must." But the house, old and swollen with humidity, groaned in reply, as if mocking her. Eliza watched from the shadows at the far end of the hall, unseen, her gaze sharp as a blade. The widow could not yet see it, not yet. But the storm she had unintentionally summoned was gathering strength, and Eliza was no longer merely surviving. She was waiting, she was planning, and soon the widow's ledger of flesh would become the record of her downfall. Winter crept across Charleston like a patient hunter, and with it came a tightening of Beatrice Wren's obsessions. Each morning she sat at the long dining table alone, a quill in hand, recording the night's events in a leather-bound ledger no slave was permitted to look upon. Every entry was neat, calculated, and cold dates, names, instructions, and notations of who had performed to her satisfaction. The slaves called it the Book of Shame, though only by whispers. It dictated their nights, their fears, and their fate. Eliza's turn had come twice more since the first night. She moved through the halls with a hollow steadiness, learned from watching older women who had endured far worse. But Beatrice saw the subtle shift in her, the quiet, hardened way she now held her shoulders, the silence she wielded like a shield. Beatrice did not like it, not one bit. So she changed the rules. That night, instead of sending a single slave into a chamber, she summoned two young women, Eliza and Corinne, a timid girl with trembling hands and a soft voice barely heard above a whisper. When Corinne's name was called, she broke into tears before she even reached the stairs. "Compose yourself," Beatrice hissed, seizing her chin. "You are not children. You are vessels of legacy. Do not insult the house with your sniveling." Eliza stepped subtly between them, guiding Corinne's hand. "Come on," she murmured gently. "It'll pass faster if we walk." The widow's eyes narrowed with interest, defiance wrapped in politeness. She recognized it, the way a hunter recognizes the first twitch of the prey's ear. But she let them go. Inside the late master's chamber, the two girls closed the heavy door behind them and exhaled a long, trembling breath. Corinne clutched Eliza like she would drown without her. "I can't do it," Corinne whimpered. "You can," Eliza whispered back. "But you won't be alone." They made a pact in that moment. Not spoken aloud words were too dangerous, but by touch, by shared breath, by the unspoken promise of protection. If they had to endure the nightmare the widow forced upon them, they would endure it together. They would not let Beatrice break them apart. Downstairs, Beatrice listened through the floorboards. Her ears strained for sobs, for desperation, a sound she fed upon like a starving animal. But the room above remained eerily quiet, too quiet. The next morning, Beatrice's jaw twitched as she wrote in her ledger, "Compliance adequate, emotional yield insufficient." That phrase would become the beginning of her downfall. By the end of January, Beatrice escalated again. She began sending the girls into rooms that had not been opened in years. The sewing room, the dusty parlor, the disused guest chamber with thick green drapery and portraits of long-dead wrens staring down in judgment. Each room carried its own cruelty, its own silent ghosts. And each night, the enslaved women grew more connected. Eliza and Corinne, Nessa and Grace. Even quiet, withdrawn, Ruth began speaking again. In the dim hours before dawn, they huddled in corners of the laundry house, exchanging whispers like smuggled coins. "She watch us all night. She want fear, not just obedience. She want to own us inside. We must not let her." Older women, Aunt Dinah, old Louise, and stiff-backed Maybelle joined them, sharing wisdom carried through generations of survival. "You keep your mind safe," Maybelle whispered, tapping her temple. "She don't get that. No mistress ever does." "And you grow your strength together," Louise added. "One woman breaks easy. A group takes an army to crack." The younger ones listened with wide eyes. For the first time, sparks of something dangerous flickered in their chests' unity. And unity was the deadliest weapon slaves ever forged. Beatrice sensed it. She felt the shift, like a cold wind under the door. One afternoon she stood on the balcony overlooking the yard, watching the women move between chores. Something in their posture had changed, subtle, nearly invisible, but she saw it anyway. Not broken, not hopeless, not afraid enough. She pressed her manicured nails into the wooden railing until the polish chipped. They were conspiring. She could feel it in her bones. So that night, she called Eliza alone to the dining hall. "Eliza," she said sweetly, pouring herself a glass of sherry, "I have noticed a troubling spirit in the quarters, a contagion, one that I suspect begins with you." Eliza kept her gaze lowered. "Mistress, I only do what I am told." "Do you?" Beatrice murmured, circling her slowly. "A good slave influences nothing. Yet somehow you, the quiet one, the obedient one, seem to inspire courage in the others." She leaned close, her breath warm and venomous. I don't need courage from you, Eliza. I need results. Eliza's heart thudded, but she said nothing. Beatrice smiled, and the smile chilled her to the bone. Tomorrow night, the widow whispered, your tasks will change. Oh, she let the words hang like a noose. You will not be in the chambers. You will assist me personally. Eliza felt the ground drop beneath her feet. For the first time since this all began, she felt real fear. Because assisting Beatrice Wren meant one thing, becoming her weapon. And Eliza knew if she did not find a way to resist soon, the widow would turn her into a monster in her own image. The storm that had been gathering all afternoon finally broke over the plantation as midnight neared. Rain fell in diagonal sheets, tapping the windows of the widow Morland's mansion like impatient fingers. Servants moved quickly through the halls, closing shutters and securing lamps, though nothing could quiet the tension that had been swelling within the house for weeks. Jonas felt it most of all. He worked alone in the narrow carpentry shed behind the garden, shaping boards with steady hands, though his heartbeat thudded like a drum in his ears. Throughout the last month, every Morland daughter had approached him in one way or another, sometimes with questions, sometimes with commands, sometimes with the brittle sharpness of those raised in wealth, but starved of genuine affection. But tonight felt different. Tonight, each woman in that house seemed to be circling around a single truth. Jonas was no longer simply the one mother chose. He had become the center of the quiet war the sisters waged against one another. He felt it in their glances, heard it in the clipped fragments of conversation they tried to hide, saw it in the widow Morland's tightened jaw whenever she descended the stairs, trying in vain to keep her daughters from fracturing entirely. Thunder rumbled again, shaking dust from the rafters. Jonas set his tools aside. Something inside him, instinct, caution, maybe even destiny, told him that staying in the workshop tonight was a mistake. He stepped out into the rain and made his way toward the mansion, just as a figure appeared on the back veranda. It was Clara. The second eldest daughter held a shawl over her head, her face pale in the storm's flickering light. "Jonas," she whispered, rushing forward. "Come inside. Now. Someone needs to speak with you." "Your mother?" he asked. "No," Clara said, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid the darkness itself might overhear. "My oldest sister, Evelyn." Jonas froze. Evelyn Morland, the late master's firstborn, had barely spoken to him since the widow declared that Jonas would serve a special household purpose. She had remained distant, controlled, watching everything from the edges like a hawk perched above a battlefield. Now she wanted him. "Why?" Jonas asked quietly. Clara swallowed. "Because she's realized what the others feel for you, and she refuses to be outmaneuvered." The storm cracked open with another bolt of lightning. Jonas followed Clara up the steps and into the lantern-lit corridor. The house smelled of damp wood and lavender oil. Candles flickered as a gust of wind pushed through an open archway. Evelyn stood at the far end of the hall, tall, poised, wrapped in a forest green gown that made her look carved from the storm itself. She regarded Jonas with a gaze he could not read, part challenge, part calculation, part something more dangerous than either. "You may go, Clara," Evelyn said without turning. Clara hesitated, worry flickering across her face. Then she obeyed and disappeared into the shadows. Jonas straightened his shoulders. "You asked for me," Evelyn approached with slow, deliberate steps that echoed off the marble floor. "Mother believes she can command fate by choosing one man," she said. "My sisters believe they can outcompete one another for the future she imagines." Her eyes lifted to his. "But you have not spoken your own intentions." Jonas exhaled. There it was, the truth no one had dared ask until now. "What do you want, Jonas?" He searched her face. There was no enticement there, no illusion of affection, no false softness. Just a woman who had spent her whole life being told she was her father's heir, only to discover that her mother had rewritten the rules. "I want freedom," Jonas answered. The hallway fell silent except for the storm's roar. Evelyn nodded once, as if she had expected that answer all along. "Then we want the same thing." Jonas blinked. "What?" Evelyn leaned in, her voice a whisper sharp enough to cut glass. "You want a life beyond these walls. I want a future beyond my mother's grasp. To achieve either, we must dismantle the one thing she values above everything else." "The family name," Jonas murmured. "Exactly." A door opened somewhere behind them. Footsteps approached light, but hurried. It was Lila, the youngest, rain-soaked and trembling. "Evelyn," she gasped. "Mother knows. She knows you're meeting with him. She's coming." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Then everything begins tonight." The Morland sisters, one determined, one frightened, stood on either side of Jonas as thunder shook the plantation. And for the first time since the widow declared him her chosen man, Jonas understood. He was no longer trapped in their plan. He had become the turning point of their rebellion. And the storm outside was nothing compared to the one rising within the Morland house. The widow believed she understood desire. She believed she understood loneliness, hunger, and the way power could curl around a woman's ribs like a warm serpent. But as the weeks stretched, and her household sank deeper into a rhythm built on secrets and shared breath, she began to realize the truth. She understood none of it. The first sign she was losing control came on a night when she climbed the stairs not for duty, not to assign a daughter, not to check on candles or windows or the alignment of her perfect little world. No, she climbed because she needed to see him. Elias. His name tasted like something forbidden. She had not spoken it aloud once, but it lived in her mouth all the same. She found him in the lantern-lit hallway, shirt undone, skin glistening from having chopped firewood late into the evening. He carried the bucket of ash like it weighed nothing. She stopped breathing. He did not speak, merely nodded as slaves were expected to do, though there was something almost respectful in his quiet acknowledgement, something that made her heartbeat throb in her ears. "You are working late," she managed. "You asked for warm rooms," he answered simply. "All 7. She swallowed hard. Yes, of course." He stepped past her, and in the few inches of space that separated them, she caught the warm musk of sweat and wood smoke. Her fingers twitched. She almost reached for him. Almost, but she fled instead, nearly tripping on her own skirts, retreating to her room like a guilty child. It did not end there. Night after night, she found herself lingering in doorways, listening for his voice through the walls, watching from windows as he hauled feed, water, timber, her eyes chasing him as though tethered. The worst part was the way her daughters noticed, not overtly, not verbally, but a subtle shift spread through the house. They grew quieter when Elias entered a room, more watchful, more possessive. They adjusted their hair, sat straighter in chairs, lowered their voices in that soft, dangerous way young women do when they are competing without admitting it. The widow told herself she didn't see it. She lied. She saw everything, but it was the night she approached the east wing that broke the fragile illusion she still had control. The second daughter's door was cracked open, a gold slice of lamplight cutting across the dark hall. The widow heard a low sound, breath, warmth, the unmistakable rhythm of 2 bodies pressed too close. Her throat tightened. She knew she should walk away. She knew this was precisely what she had intended, what she had orchestrated, what she had commanded. But she couldn't move. Her hand hovered at the crack, fingers shaking. She shouldn't look. She knew she shouldn't. And yet something stronger than will, something raw, primal, shameful, pulled her forward. Inside, her daughter lay with Elias, but not as the widow had feared, not clinging, not weeping, not needy. No, her daughter was whispering to him, laughing softly, touching his face like a wife touches a husband. Elias leaned toward her with a tenderness the widow had not known he possessed. It wasn't duty, it wasn't obedience, it wasn't need. It was affection, real affection. The widow staggered back as if struck. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling the cry rising in her throat. This was not part of the arrangement. Slaves were not meant to love. Daughters were not meant to choose. And she was not meant to feel anything at all. She returned to her room, trembling violently. She stared at her own reflection, at her graying hair, her hollowed cheeks, the widowhood that had settled into her bones like winter rot. "What are you doing?" she whispered to herself. What had she unleashed? What had she created? What monster was she becoming? And why did her jealousy burn so hot it frightened even her? But the night was not done with her. Not yet. An hour later, a soft knock sounded on her door. She knew instantly who it was. Elias stepped inside, lantern light catching the sharp lines of his jaw, the curve of muscle along his arms. His eyes met hers not with fear, not with duty, but with something unreadable. "You called for me," he said. "I did not." "You did," he repeated, stepping closer. Not with words. Her breath hitched. For a long stretch of silence, they simply looked at each other. Two people trapped in a house, charged with desire, obligation, and secrets neither could name without the whole fragile world shattering. Then he spoke softly. "You're losing sleep." She flinched. "How do you?" "I hear you pacing," he murmured. Every night, her chest tightened. The room felt too small, too warm, too dangerous. "Go," she whispered. "Please. Before I ruin everything. Before I admit anything. Before I become the thing they whisper about in town. A widow with needs sharper than hunger." Elias did not move. He watched her. He waited. He breathed slowly, deeply, deliberately, and then, without touching her, without a single word more, he turned and left her alone with the truth she feared most. She had set this world in motion, but she was no longer the one steering it. Something else, desire, jealousy, fate, had taken the reins, and it was coming for all of them. The storm rolled in before sundown, heavy, swollen clouds that hung low over the widow's estate, like a bruise spreading across the sky. Lightning stitched the horizon. Thunder rolled through the floorboards. Every servant fled indoors. Every girl shuttered her window. The house trembled under the weight of the coming rain. Except for Naomi, she stood at her mother's vanity, fingertips grazing the silver comb she had stolen. A comb her father had once gifted the widow. A comb the widow had said no child could ever touch because nothing of hers belonged to them, not even memories. Naomi lifted it anyway. Tonight wasn't about fear. Tonight wasn't about obedience. Tonight she was ready to decide which bloodline she belonged to, her mother's cruelty or Samuel's quiet fire. Down the hall, the widow was pouring wine. She had already drunk half the bottle. She cursed the storm, cursed the damp air, cursed the children she'd birthed and the ones she hadn't, especially the sons she never received. She cursed Samuel for reminding her of everything she could not control. She did not yet know the storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside her home. Samuel was in the servants' quarters, pacing. The widow had summoned him earlier with a single message. "Tonight you will attend Naomi's room, not Clara's, not Ruth's, not Eliza's or Miriam's. Naomi, the one daughter whose eyes did not fear him, whose voice did not tremble, whose hatred for her mother burned as clean and bright as his own." But he wasn't afraid of Naomi. He was afraid of what the widow intended. The last time she had changed the rules, someone bled. Outside, the rain broke open. The roof rattled. Wind howled through the shutters. Samuel clenched his fists, feeling the storm tug at him. He knew what was coming. He had felt it building for months, whispers of rebellion in the kitchen, quiet planning in the fields, hidden glances exchanged between those who'd had enough. But tonight was different. Tonight, Naomi was calling for him. The hallway was dark when he approached her bedroom. The candles had blown out. Only lightning lit the corridor, sharp and white and dangerous. He could hear Naomi breathing behind the door, steady, certain. Before he could knock, she opened it. Her hair was damp from the storm air drifting through her cracked window. The silver comb gleamed in her hand. "You came," she whispered. "I was told to." She stepped closer, her voice low. "Not by her, by me." Another crack of thunder shook the walls. Naomi closed the door behind him. "I won't be like her," she said softly. "I won't treat you like she does. I won't treat you like something owned." "You shouldn't say things like that," Samuel warned, though part of him leaned closer just to hear her keep talking. "I say what I want," she replied, "because tonight is when everything changes." He stared at her, trying to understand. Naomi lifted the silver comb. "She says I inherited nothing from my father," she murmured. "But I did. I inherited his rage." Lightning flashed. In that moment, the widow's voice pierced the hallway. "Naomi!" She was outside the door, drunk, unsteady, furious. Naomi didn't flinch. Samuel didn't breathe. The widow slammed her hand against the wood. "Open this door. Open it right now. What are you doing in there?" Naomi stepped forward and whispered through the crack. "Something you can't control." The widow gasped. "You ungrateful little—" But she never finished. The house shuddered with another burst of thunder, and in that moment, Naomi turned to Samuel and said something he never expected to hear. "Tonight, we end her." Samuel froze. "Naomi, she took everything from you," Naomi whispered. "And from me. I won't let her take anything else." The widow continued to pound. "Open this door." Naomi raised her chin. "You're either with me," she whispered, "or you let her win forever." Samuel saw it then, her strength, her terror, her desperation, her fire. She was no child. She was a storm. And storms didn't ask permission to break. He moved toward the window. "Come with me," he said. She looked startled. "Out into the storm? It's better than staying in this house," the widow shouted again, her voice cracked with rage. Naomi stared at Samuel, then at the door, then back at him, and nodded. Samuel lifted the window. Wind howled in. Rain lashed the floorboards. The storm swallowed the light. Behind them, the door frame splintered under the widow's fist. Naomi grabbed Samuel's hand. They leapt into the dark together. The storm closed around them. The widow screamed, and the night opened like a blade. The widow's house had always been full of shadows, shadows from portraits, shadows from velvet drapes, shadows from the dead husband who seemed to linger in every hallway. But on this night, the shadows felt different. They moved with intention. They pressed against the walls as if listening. Samuel felt them watching him as he moved from room to room. For weeks, he had lived under the strange, suffocating command of Mrs. Hawthorne. Populate every bedroom, restore the lineage, fill this house with the heirs her husband never made. The daughters, each one grieving, confused, lonely, and shaped by their mother's desperation, had become both Samuel's burden and his moral puzzle. He did not hate them. None had chosen this life any more than he had. But something had changed in the house. It began with the doors. At first, only one bedroom door refused to stay shut. Then a second, then the nursery that had never held a child of its own. The hinges groaned, drifting open on their own as if pulled by a quiet breath. Mrs. Hawthorne blamed drafts, faulty carpentry, even the weight of humidity. But the daughters whispered another explanation. Father wasn't done. Samuel didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in pain, in grief, in despair that could twist itself into superstition. But even he felt the tension. The air in the house felt stretched, thin as paper about to tear. On the seventh night of the door's opening, Mrs. Hawthorne summoned him to her late husband's study. The old man's things still filled the room, his rifles, his books, his stiff formal coat that hung on a mannequin, watching. Samuel had always avoided the place. It smelled of tobacco, rage, and a man who had refused to see anyone as human. Mrs. Hawthorne stood by the desk, her fingers pressed to a single page from her husband's journal. "You must continue," she said quietly. "No matter what happens in this house, no matter what you hear." Samuel stiffened. "Ma'am, your daughters are frightened. I don't care what they feel," she snapped. Then she caught herself, softening. "I do not mean to be cruel, but this house cannot die with me. My husband controlled everything, Samuel, everything but the future. I am trying to finish what he started." Samuel stared at the journal page she held. The handwriting was sharp, angry, almost carved into the paper. He could make out a single line. "No heir of mine will inherit what is rightfully mine." Mrs. Hawthorne folded the paper before he could read more. "Ignore the doors," she said. "Ignore the noises. Ignore the fear. My daughters will listen to me." But Samuel could see it in her eyes. She didn't believe her own words. That night, as he retired to the small servant's room he had been given, the whispers began. Soft at first, then clearer. Not words exactly, but breaths, a shape of sound, familiar in its hatred. He sat up in the dark, muscles tight. The hall outside his room was pitch black, except for a thin glow from a lone oil lamp left burning down the corridor. Then he heard it wood dragging, a slow creak, one of the upstairs doors opening on its own. He rose. He stepped into the hallway. At the far end, the nursery door had swung wide, swaying gently. A draft did not make doors sway like that. A draft did not feel intentional. One by one, other doors opened, first the eldest daughter's, then the second, then the third, until all 7 stood open like waiting mouths. Samuel's pulse hammered, not from fear of spirits, but from the realization that someone living or dead wanted him to enter them, wanted him to continue, wanted him to obey. Behind him, he heard soft footsteps. He turned. It was the youngest daughter, Clara, barefoot, trembling. "Samuel," she whispered, clutching her nightdress. "We didn't open them." "I know," he said gently. She swallowed, voice breaking. "Mother says you will give us life, but the house feels like it doesn't want us to have any." Before Samuel could speak, a gust of wind rushed through the corridor, snuffing the lamp flame. Darkness swallowed them. Clara whimpered, gripping his arm, and in the perfect silence that followed, Samuel finally heard what had been waiting behind the doors. A low, steady breathing. Human. Alive. Someone else was in the bedrooms. Someone who did not belong there. And Samuel understood. They were no longer dealing with ghosts of the dead, but with a danger fully alive, fully present, and fully willing to stop the family's future by tearing it apart from within. The house was quiet, but the walls seemed to hum with anticipation. Every room bore a lingering weight of secrets, of whispered commands and stifled cries. Yet tonight was different. Tonight, the widow, Eleanor Whitcomb, paced the wide hallway with a rigid precision, her gown rustling against the polished floors, her shadow stretching like a dark omen across the walls. Her eyes, cold and calculating, darted toward each door, as if each held a piece of a puzzle only she could solve. Samuel, the young slave she had kept under her strictest watch, knelt by the parlor window, his fingers folded in a silent prayer. He had long ceased to hope for mercy. Every day brought a new task, a new humiliation, a new layer of control to wear him down. Yet beneath his silent obedience simmered a quiet, dangerous awareness. He had learned the rhythms of the house, the timing of her moods, the habits of the other servants, and the way the widow's daughters tiptoed through the hall, carefully avoiding her gaze while trying to maintain their fragile lives. He had learned patience, and patience could turn into opportunity. Tonight, Eleanor had a new plan. Her husband had left her wealth and land, but no sons, no heirs. She had spent the last 5 years orchestrating a series of measures to fill the void, to bend fate in her favor. Samuel was at the center of her design. One by one, he had been called into the private chambers of each daughter, each encounter measured and controlled, dictated by Eleanor's cruel obsession with legacy. The house groaned with the weight of its own secrets, the floors and walls soaked in silent witness. As Eleanor moved toward the first bedroom, she adjusted the folds of her dress, pausing to ensure her jewelry caught the candlelight just so, projecting an image of authority and wealth. Her daughters watched from the shadows, their eyes wide, trembling, yet powerless. They could not defy her, not openly. Defiance had been punished too severely in the past. The youngest, Lillian, tugged at her mother's sleeve as Eleanor prepared to enter the first room, her small voice quivering. "Mother, must we?" But Eleanor only smiled, sharp and cold. "It is not for your understanding, child," she said. "It is for our future." Meanwhile, Samuel waited, alert but still, his mind calculating the impossibility of escape and the possibility of leverage. He had observed patterns, Eleanor's moods, the subtle shifts in her attention, the moments when her guard dropped. He had watched as her daughters hesitated, as the fear and resentment grew in their eyes. And tonight, for the first time in years, he sensed an opening. Not a physical one, not yet, but a psychological fracture, a crack in her relentless control. The first bedroom door creaked open. Samuel rose, steady and silent, following her to the threshold. Eleanor's sharp voice cut through the dim light. "You know your place, Samuel. Tonight is not for conversation. Tonight is for obedience." Her hands tightened on the folds of her gown, as if the fabric itself were a leash. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, the bed neatly made as if awaiting a ritual that had been performed countless times before. He stepped in, careful, his eyes on hers, reading every twitch, every subtle gesture. Then, for a fleeting moment, Eleanor's expression faltered. A shadow passed across her face, quick and almost imperceptible. Samuel seized it, just the tiniest opportunity, storing it deep in his mind. The widow would not notice, perhaps, but the seed of resistance had been planted. One day, he thought, one day this house will not be hers to control. One day, she will not dictate who lives, who serves, who bears her legacy. He obeyed for now. He could not afford to act prematurely, but within him the quiet fire of rebellion burned brighter than ever. And as Eleanor continued from room to room, orchestrating her cold ambitions, Samuel's gaze lingered on the youngest daughter, Lillian, her face pale with fear and shame. He realized that not all of them were complicit, some were prisoners of circumstance, like him, and perhaps, just perhaps, alliances could be formed. Tonight, he served, but tomorrow the seeds of vengeance and liberation would grow. Years passed, and the Whitcomb estate bore the marks of time and decay. The grand halls that had once echoed with Eleanor's sharp commands now hummed with silence. Her daughters, some lost to illness, some married off far from the plantation, left only whispers of their mother's relentless obsession. The rooms that had served as instruments of her ambition now sat empty, the beds cold and undisturbed, the curtains heavy with dust. Samuel had endured. He had carried the weight of those years with a quiet cunning that no one suspected. Every small observation, every pattern memorized, had prepared him for the moment when the balance of power would shift, and when it finally came, it was as subtle as it was absolute. Eleanor, older now, her sharpness dulled by time but not by vanity, failed to notice the way Samuel moved through the estate silent, confident, invisible to her eyes trained only to watch for obedience. On a stormy evening, much like the nights of her orchestrated schemes, Eleanor called Samuel to her side. She had aged, but her presence still carried the commanding aura that had dictated the lives of all who dwelled there. She gestured to him, expecting compliance. But Samuel, standing tall and still, met her gaze directly. There was no fear. Not anymore. "You've grown bold," Eleanor said, her voice brittle, tinged with both disbelief and irritation. "Do you not remember your place?" "I remember everything," Samuel replied evenly, his tone carrying the weight of decades. "I remember what was done, and I remember why it was done. But the place you dictated no longer exists, not for you, not for me." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, searching for a crack in his defiance, but found none. She had underestimated the silent strength he had cultivated over the years, the patience that had turned suffering into preparation. Her daughter's children, those she had manipulated into being part of her twisted legacy, had grown up without her strict oversight, free in ways she could no longer control. As the storm outside battered the windows, the estate seemed to respond, groaning under the weight of its own secrets. Samuel turned, walking toward the wide doors that led to the fields, the legacy of toil and fear stretching before him. The wind caught the curtains, stirring them like the ghosts of those long past. Eleanor, frozen, could do nothing but watch, realizing at last that her plans, her control, her obsession with heirs and bloodlines, had failed. Time and persistence had overturned her authority. Quietly but irreversibly, Samuel stepped outside into the rain, letting it wash over him, cleansing the years of servitude and submission. He looked out over the fields, over the house, over the quiet graves of those whose lives had been marked by Eleanor's schemes. Freedom, finally, was not a dramatic moment of confrontation. It was the slow, undeniable unraveling of power long held. The estate would remain, a monument to ambition and cruelty, but it no longer belonged to her. It belonged, in small and subtle ways, to those she had tried to control and subjugate. Samuel's path forward would not be easy. The world beyond the Whitcomb estate was filled with peril, yet he had learned the most important lesson of all. Survival was not enough. To live fully, to own one's fate, required patience, intelligence, and, when necessary, quiet retribution. Eleanor Whitcomb would pass from the estate years later, leaving behind a house of silence and dust, a testament to her obsessive control and the futility of forcing life and blood to obey one's will. Samuel, having endured, having witnessed, and having outlasted her, stepped into the morning light. The future spread before him like an open field. The halls remained empty, but the echoes of the past no longer held power over the living. Freedom, long delayed, had been claimed not through open revolt, but through resilience, patience, and an unyielding will to endure. And as Samuel walked away from the house that had been his cage and his crucible, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of one who had survived and ultimately triumphed. The Whitcomb estate, for all its wealth and ambition, had been undone not by a violent uprising, but by the steady accumulation of strength in the heart of one who had been considered powerless. And in that truth, the legacy of Eleanor's tyranny was finally eclipsed by the endurance of the enslaved, a testament to the indomitable spirit that could not be contained, coerced, or destroyed.